But also in the second part of my talk, I will talk about the colonial period, the 19th and 20th century, when the relics were, as I say, discovered, rediscovered, and redistributed. So it's really, looking at the past or looking at the ancient period from the lens or from the perspective of the 19th and 20th century. And the point I'm making is that in my perspective, in my view, this is very essential because you need to look at the colonial lens if you want to understand what changed in a variety of ways. I will not go into that. In a variety of ways, not just theoretical, but also in terms of survival and discovery. So that's the first point. Why am I doing this? Why am I interested in Buddhism? Why am I interested in relics? The larger question that I'm trying to raise is that a lot of us, we study Buddhism based largely from a South Asian perspective or from an Indian perspective. So we think, this is self-contained. And what we do not study is, or are not taught, and this is one of the issues we were just discussing, is the global scene. Because in the 19th and 20th century, or even earlier, I don't think you can study any aspect of our history without relevance, without looking at what was happening around us. So that's the larger point that I'm trying to make, and I will bring that in as we go along. The other point that I would like to talk about are all 19th, 20th century. But these newspapers, word. Sorry. So, is there some way I can get this on one slide? Sorry, I think maybe I did something wrong. Oh, I see, okay. Yeah, okay, thanks. So how do I change it then? They collected his ashes, and we do even today. And those are what constituted the relics. So that's the first point. What you see on your screen is an image, which is an image from Gandhar, which is today Pakistan or Afghanistan. It dates to the 3rd, 4th century CE. And what it shows is the Buddha lying, while he's passing away, and his disciples mourning around him. And this is the scene before. The next scene, which shows the cremation, is actually depicted, but it's very rarely presented in museum collections. So if you ever go to the Indian Museum, Kolkata, you will find a very nice, a very interesting scene from Gandhar, which shows the cremation of the Buddha. Now, what happened after his cremation and after the collection of relics was that there was a fight, not between his disciples, but the fight was between the kings who ruled in the neighboring regions and wanted the relics to be given to them rather than to his disciples. We hear about these. Now, there are several registers that I'm talking about. The stories that I'm telling you are stories which appear in Buddhist texts. These are not contemporary to the Buddha. The texts are later than the life of the Buddha. So the texts mostly are 1st, 2nd century CE. The images that you see are again 1st, 2nd century CE. They are not contemporary to the life of the Buddha. But what is interesting and what is significant is that how some of these memories of what happened to the Buddha, his collection of his relics and so on, they appear so prominently on our monuments. And this is where, and I would like to strongly suggest, if some of you can visit some of these sites, and I'm sure some of you have done already, just to be on the lookout of many of these sites many of these events which we study in history, but are here presented very graphically on our monuments. So what you see on the top of the screen is the battle scene, which talks about the fight. You see the elephants on both sides, the gates in the middle, and the fight between the Shakyas and the Mallas This is depicted on the gateway at Sanchi and shows this fight that took place. At the bottom of the screen, what you see is the resolution of this fight, and the resolution happened because a Brahman, he agreed to distribute the relics in 8. He made 8 pots of the relics, and he distributed it to the 8 rajas. And you see the pots on the table, and the Brahman sitting behind them. And that's again an image from Gandhar, dated to the 1st and 2nd century CE. So what is the relevance of this whole narrative, and what is the relevance of this fight, and the fact that these relics were redistributed into 8. So what happened next, and where were these relics put, and what happened to these relics? So these relics were then taken, and these stupas were built. So this is a picture. This is actually a 19th century or a early 20th century picture taken, and you see these visuals in many collections, particularly in the British Library collection and many others, the Archaeological Survey collection, which shows how the landscape, at least the religious landscape, changed around in the post-Mauryan period, around the 1st and 2nd century CE. And this landscape changed because new structures, new religious architecture was now built and was constructed. And this architecture came up when these relics, I showed you the caskets, when these caskets were taken and stupas were built on top of these. Okay, so now, and all of you also know the fact that the Mauryan king Ashoka, he's credited with building 84,000 stupas on these relics. So the basic point is that these relics then led to their enshrinement in stupas, led to the changing religious landscape of the subcontinent and of other countries around us. And now, who is credited? Who is the agency? There are many narratives, and also many other agents through our inscriptions. So while had relics enshrined in them, certainly archaeologically we do see these relics enshrined. So one kind of source, we have to look at a multiplicity of sources, and as always, my implicit agenda is to promote archaeology and to say, we all need to look at archaeology and do it more creatively and in interesting ways. The second point that I would like to also make is that the relics, over time, they changed in nature. So it was not always bones and ash. Yes, it started with that. It also became texts. So religious texts, Dhammacetya, or the written word. So these texts could be texts written on stone. They could be texts written on palm leaf manuscripts. These could be texts written on copper plates. So they are the texts which then come up. We also know from archaeology that bronze images were then enshrined in stupas as relics. So the point then is, if you look at archaeology, you see the changing nature of relics over time. And one of the things why relics are so important, and one of the reasons why relics are so important, is that these relics form the basis or the foundation of all forms of Buddhism. So we've got used to looking at Buddhism as Theravada, Hinayana, Vajrayana, Mahayana, and so on. South Asian Buddhism, Southeast Asian Buddhism, Central Asian Buddhism, so on and so forth. But it's essentially, the foundation is the enshrinement of relics. So really, relic enshrinement forms that foundation. And monks and nuns were important carriers of these relics. So wherever they went, they enshrined these relics in stupas. And I have mentioned the fact that the nature of relics changed. We also get gems and pearls enshrined in stupas, and certainly the whole scenario, I would argue, changed radically with the development of archaeology in the 19th century. Archaeology, as you know, developed in Europe. It came to India. with the setting up of the Archaeological Survey in 1861, and post 1861, the practice of archaeology changed the way in which the Buddhist past came to be viewed dramatically. In one way that it changed the past was, the fact that as a result of the conservation that was done, many of the areas around the stupas were cleared. So if you go to Sanchi today, you won't see these smaller stupas. This is from Takshila, and what you see in the center is the Dharmarajika stupa at Takshila, and around it there were smaller relics which were buried and which were then also renovated. At the bottom you see the relic caskets which have been found in large numbers. So as a result of the discovery of these stupas, as a result of conservation efforts, the area around the stupa was cleared. So today, that's why when you go to Sanchi, you don't see the relic caskets enshrined around or the smaller stupas around it. You only see nice green domes. So conservation, I would say, in the 19th century, changed radically the nature of many of our monuments. So we often seem to think that we need only study when a monument was built and know only about who built the monument, but seldom talk about how these monuments changed as a result of conservation efforts in the 19th century. And this is on the left-hand side. You see the large number of relic caskets that have been found, and you can see the variation. You can also see the fact that there may have been many relics that were buried around these stupas. On the right-hand side, you see these the main stupa at Takshila, and the green grass lawns around it. Other areas, particularly particularly coastal Andhra, where relic enshrinement is evident, and the dots that you see on the screen are dots when relics were enshrined. Was there a ceremony? Were there any rituals which were performed? Who came to this relic enshrinement? Was it that somebody just took a casket and then went to a stupa and then enshrined it? Was that it? Or and it's 19th century, in the 1870s. In the 19th century, one of the reasons why so-called archaeologists, these were not actually trained archaeologists, they were military officials. Why were they traveling? Why were they looking at stupas? They were traveling because they were surveyors, they were building roads, they were building railways, they were also doing espionage and military activity. So a lot of these stupas were discovered not as a result of concerted effort at understanding Buddhism, but as a byproduct of building roads or building railways or military activity. And even Alexander Cunningham, the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey, was a military official. So, and Patiprolu is no exception. It was discovered as a result of the roads being built. At that time, what was done to the stupas was that a trench was dug. You can see the trench in the middle, where it talks about the axial post. That a trench was dug from the top to reach the center of the stupa. This was not archaeology. This was by no means archaeology. This was really an attempt to collect the relics. And why were relics? Why did they want to collect relics? Why did the military officials? Why were they so interested in collecting relics? Because the relics could be sold to museums. The relics could be taken away. So it was good profiteering, and remember that our laws for protection of heritage come up much later. There are no laws in the 19th century and early 20th century. And even when they come up, they are very lax. So looking for relics, looking for, going deep into stoops or digging a tunnel from the top of the stoop into the center to collect these gems and relics and so on was a very profitable business. All right. And here you see some stoops. Here in this context, this is Bhattiprolu. It has three caskets, three major caskets, stone containers. And these stone containers, inside them were relics. Some of these containers were inscribed. You see on the right-hand side. This is an inscription at the mouth of this large stone container. If you want to see these containers, they are today in the Madras Museum. So if you go to Madras Museum, you can see this only the stone containers. So one of the problems or one of the end results of 19th century supposed archaeology was the fragmentation of the sources. So these stone containers are in the Madras Museum. We'll come to what happened to the Bhattiprolu relic casket. But this Bhattiprolu is also important for my purposes because it shows the ritual that was involved in the enshrinement of these relics. So you have that swastika at the bottom, which was made of silver punch mark coins, often associated with the Mauryas. The inscriptions talk about the merchant, the Shramana or the monk, the Raja, who were all present at the time that these relics were enshrined. But what is also interesting is that these relics were taken in a procession. The inscriptions or the donations or the donor who had made the donation, his name was loudly pronounced. So this was sort of told to the audiences who were present there, and then the relics were enshrined. So the point then is, after enshrinement, these relic caskets, relics were not meant to be seen, right? They were underground. They were inside the stoop. So you were not meant to, or nobody was meant to actually have a look at it. This was what the practice was. So how does that change in the 19th century? And does that change? After we start discovering all these relic caskets. So in the 19th century, what you see, and I've shown this slide before to you, what you see are these mounds of brick. Nobody quite knew, what they were associated with. A lot of and this is again very fascinating. If you read, some of the oral legends in Punjab, particularly under Maharaja Ranjit Singh, these are often associated with the Greeks. And these were often associated with Alexander's coming and the fact that the Greeks had built these. So the British and the British military officials were not looking for Buddhist relics; they were looking for the Greeks, and that's how they discovered the stoops. And then the question was, so what do these stoops indicate? I mean, what religion? And that is how then you have the understanding of Buddhism come up. So clearly they were not looking for Buddhism, they were looking for the Greeks. Second point I have said, and this is particularly true of Afghanistan. The British were very scared in India that the Russians would attack them through Afghanistan. So there was a lot of espionage activity, a lot of officials were sent into Afghanistan, and these officials, by the side, collected relics. I said it was good money, or you could make money with it. So it was through espionage that some of these were discovered, and of course our major destroyers of heritage were railway lines and surveying for roads. So how many of these were discovered? I mean, okay, fine, I'm saying it, but how many of these do we know that they were discovered? So if you're looking at the 19th, and the second point I'm going to make is that there was a difference between what happened in the 19th century and the 20th century. So 19th century, there are at least all these that are listed. The Manikyala, which was the earliest one, I'll show you, it's in Pakistan now, near Islamabad. And Manikyala was discovered by a French general of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And in fact, when he dug into the mound, and he was also looking for Alexander's horse, which is supposed to have been buried at Manikyala. So when he found the stoop, he sent a note to Maharaja Ranjit Singh saying that he's found the burial place of the horse of Alexander. So there was Manikyala, there was Sarnath. Sarnath, 1836, but Sarnath, it is lost. It had a slab with an inscription that is lost. Sanchi, 1851, Sanchi, all the relic caskets are now in the British Museum. Some came back, not all. Sopara in Maharashtra, they are in the Bombay Asiatic Society, and Girnar in Rajkot Museum. So my question to you is, these relics were sacred objects. When they were found, what happened to them? So the reliquaries, which were the most beautifully made and crafted, were sent to museums. The relics themselves, the relics were only bone and ash. It was very difficult. I mean, they just got lost, and so all these are lost. Some of the gems were there. Some of the gems, were kept or stolen. And this is the first one. So I will talk about smaller stoops around it, which should have been. They're all flattened out as a result of conservation. These are, it no longer exists. It's lost. One is Pepe's. The Prabha relics, which were discovered in the Nepalese Terai, and as all of you who do modern history, as you know, that the Terai area was deforested and was granted, landed estates were granted to many colonial officials, and one of them was the Birdpur estate of William Pepe, and he was interested. He found in his estate many of these mounds, the mounds that I have shown you. So he started excavating, particularly after, as you see here, particularly after Vincent Smith, who's also a historian, who wrote a book, History of India. After his visit in 1897, he started excavating these mounds. And of course, in these mounds, he came across a rich treasure. And this treasure consisted of these reliquaries. There was an inscription on this, and not surprisingly, it said these are the relics of the Buddha. Naturally, they were not going to give the biography of whosoever relics they were. But the interesting point is that these relics were all contained in a stone, in a large stone casket. This is the stone chest that you see from Pipravakot. The stone chest is now in the Indian Museum, Kolkata. At the bottom of your screen, you see the crystal bowls. And of course, there was a lot of pearls, gems, smaller objects that were there. What is very interesting, and this brings me to a point that I made earlier, is the fact that the print media was very excited about this find, this 19th century find by Pepe and at Piprava. And I'll show you in a moment, some of these reportings. But it also got to the it got to William Hoy, who was the commissioner of Gorakhpur division, and he reported the finds in the Pioneer, which was an Indian paper. The Pioneer also had a long account about Vincent Smith, his visit, and how he deciphered the inscription. But what I found quite fascinating was the reporting by American newspapers at this time. When we talk about what's happening in India, we often discuss, the colonial period with reference to what is happening in the UK. We seldom discuss what is happening in the US. And Buddhism really had a global reach, starting from the US, I would argue, rather than Europe, UK, and the other way around. So, and this was quite a startling revelation when I started looking at these at the reporting. Certainly, I mean, Indian newspapers, yes, of course, you expect that they would be reported in the Indian newspapers. But what about the New York Times? And the New York Times, April 10th, 1910, it carried this huge article. And what I find fascinating about this reporting is two things. What about the 19th Buddhism related to finds? So, this is a fascinating aspect, not just the reporting, but the way the reporting is presented in the media and the way in which, these visuals are interspersed with the data. Again, another one, this is again from the US, Daily Morning News, May 22nd, 1910. And this again has shows the parinirvana of the Buddha, a Buddhist monk there, and then again, talks about the decipherment of these relics. The finding of these relics, the discovery of these relics. So this is something which I am still working on. I would be very interested if any of you has any leads on it. I would like to explain the American interest in Buddhism on two events. One is the Theosophical Society, which was founded in 1875 in New York. And it was a society which was interested in the occult. And the fact, occult, and the understanding of occult was a big thing in US at this point in time. Helena Blavatsky, she founded the society. Of course, there are many scandals and there are many problems, which I don't want to go to. But Henry Olcott was the secretary. And after there were problems in New York, and after there was a lot of negative reporting in the American media about Blavatsky and about the Theosophical Society. So they moved from there and moved to Sri Lanka, where the Theosophical Society then set up its headquarters, and there's a headquarters today in Adyar, the central headquarters, which is in Madras. And of course, the Theosophical Society had offices all over Southeast Asia. The second interesting point I find is the World Parliament of Religions, which was held in Chicago. And it was again 19th century, 1893. So what were the religions that were represented? We all know about Swami Vivekananda, and he made his speech, and he, which is often repeated. What is not often repeated is the importance that was given to Buddhism. And in fact, no surprises, the largest delegation was that of the Christians, because the Americans at this point believed that the next century is the century of Christianity. So, so obviously the largest delegation was that of the Christianity, and you see to Prabha. So the point then is that Buddhism had a large global following. It was not only of interest in India, but was of interest, across the world, and particularly the US. And I will come to in a moment why that is important. Why to the Buddhist kings of that period. The Buddhist kings of that period were many. Burma had a Buddhist king. Sri Lanka had, Japan had. So why Thailand? They found the Thai monarch because Burma was under the British, Sri Lanka was under the British. And so in 1899, to a representative of the Thai king, the reliquaries were sent to the museum, and the excavator, William Pepe, he was allowed to keep many of the items from the excavation. Now came the scandal, because the inscription, you remember, the inscription had said these are the relics of the Buddha. The inscription, I had mentioned that, Vincent Smith visited the site, and then he had said, these are important relics. But so had Anton Führer. Anton Führer was in the Archaeological Survey, and there was a major scandal because, I mean, I don't want to go into this, but he was accused of faking, of imitating or faking inscriptions. So he was accused that, you know, he was actually writing inscriptions, not only deciphering them. And one of the fake inscriptions that he produced, it was argued, is this Prabha inscription. So this controversy, it still lives on, and there is a big book that has been written. Both on one side is Pepe family, and they have got people to write a book. On the other side is a journalist who argues that, you know, this Pepe family is they made money out of what was a fake inscription. So this, I mean, it hasn't died out. So we are still, seeing this. But let me move on now from Prabha to what is happening in the 20th century. 20th century, the most important find of relics was at Mirpur Khas. This was 1910. 4th century stupa. Mirpur Khas is in Sindh, today in Pakistan. There's nothing at the site. The site has been flattened. But the terracottas, and you can see the beautiful terracottas from Mirpur Khas. Fortunately, Henry Cousins, who excavated the site, was also a trustee of the Prince of Wales Museum, as it was then known, in Mumbai. Today it's the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya in Mumbai. So if you want to see the terracottas, they are in Mumbai, but there's nothing at the site. But as with other finds, as with other cases, this was also widely reported. It was reported in the Statesman, in Idaho, and in the center they show the stoop, which I said was flattened out. So at that point, when it was found in the 20th century, the stoop still existed. The brick structure was still there, and around it you see all the terracottas that they had found at the site. But 20th century is also somewhat different. Because especially after Piprava had been, relics had been given away to the Thai king, there was a lot of protests in India. The protests came from from the Mahabodhi Society, and also some of the Hindu journals like Brahmavadi. And the argument that they made was that relics were sacred objects. They were sacred objects of India. The British colonial state had no business to distribute them to XYZ. The Mahabodhi Society had been set up by Anagarik Dharmapal. So the British, the colonial state, and this you see in many, many cases, the colonial state said, okay, if they are the sacred objects, you build a temple, you raise money to build a temple, and if you can raise money and if you can build a temple, then we will allow you to keep these objects. But if you can't, if there is no place to put these objects, then we have to gift it away. So this was a big challenge to the Mahabodhi Society, whether they could raise enough money to build it. Was able to raise this money, was able to build, like in the earlier times, taken in a procession and reinstalled. But let us see the Mahabodhi Society and as and when it becomes important. So it was set up in 1891 in Colombo in Sri Lanka for the revival of Buddhism, and Henry Olcott of the Theosophical Society was the director. 1892 it moved to Calcutta. So the first temple that the Mahabodhi Society built was in Calcutta. The Mool Gandhakuti programs were held. The relics were taken in a procession, and there are plaques there, so you don't have to take my word for it. There are plaques there which gave how much money, and the fact that where new construction could be done, and that this site was known from the 19th century. From 1835, the government of India had acquired land at that site. More importantly, the excavations yielded what is today our national emblem, the lion capital, and the Ashokan pillar. And you see the excavations by the Archaeological Survey, the Ashokan pillar in the foreground, and the lion capital in the background. And this, of course, is our national capital. It was a huge site. It's not that it just had the Ashokan pillar and the lion capital. It did have, in all fairness, a 19th century Jain temple, but it also had a 12th century monastery. It was the Deer Park. This is, remember, the place where the Buddha gave his first sermon. So there's the Deer Park there. There's an apsidal shrine, Thamek Stoop, where the earliest relic was found. So it's interesting that at this site, this new construction or the new temple was allowed to be done. Now, once they allowed it, many of the relics that were found at archaeological sites were now, in the 20th century, given to the Mahabodhi Society. So one of them was the relics from Nagarjun Konda, and these were given to the Mahabodhi Society. They were enshrined in the Mool Gandhakuti. The other ones, the other relics were from Mirpur Khas. I had said that the terracottas are in the museum, but the relics from Mirpur Khas are enshrined in the Mool Gandhakuti, and these were enshrined in 1934. And these were not private events, I would say. These were events where colonial officials participated. Here you have, I had said that the sites were reconfigured. We've seen this with Sanchi, we've seen this with Sarnath. So many of our ancient sites became decontextualized. So today, many of us who do ancient history look at inscriptions, and we don't look at where the inscription originally was. In fact, whether that inscription on the relic, in a way, it has colored the way in which we have framed the study of Buddhism or the study of the past. Lastly, that certainly the archaeological data, but not just the material culture, but also the way in which this material culture was excavated, was found, was represented, was reported in media. All of this, I think, needs to be looked at rather than just providing a narrative. So with that, I will stop. I do hope that some of the students here would take this up, and at least when they look at some of our monuments or they go visit some of our monuments, they would read up as to what happened to them in the colonial period. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Questions? May I start, and then maybe the others can gather their own. I was just thinking about the fact that you mentioned that the forgery of the inscription. So is it not possible, to see, would that be so easy if you have, if you're making etchings which are very recent on a relic or any antiquity? I'm sure that that's possible to realize that this is a very old sort of etching, or is it a new one? So I was just wondering about that. And another thing, I just constantly keep thinking about the Buddha being considered as an avatar.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that somehow tie up? Is there some Hinduism involved here, in some Hindu interests? And of course, 19th century, creation of various traditions, and that's happening. And there's also that whole Dalai Lama is coming from Tibet, and that's very political. So, and then there's also the Buddha as Vishnu. So how does that somehow impact, looking at the relics of the Buddha?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot for those. So the first question, is linked less to trying to find out whether the inscription is fake or not, in the way in which you suggested that, it would be possible to see whether these etchings were new or not. it is more to do, and again, this is 19th, 20th century archaeology, but I suppose even archaeology today. Führer got a bad name. He was thrown out, I mean, for a whole lot of reasons. And then, in fact, his patron, George Bühler, in Germany, it's not clear, he committed suicide. He went on a boat ride and, of the archaeological survey. I think all of these played a very important role in Führer being sort of debunked as a scholar. When we look at the regions and the micro regions, you find Buddhism changes in many different ways. And I've often been surprised, and this is where my pet thing on maritime history comes in, that, what is happening in Sri Lanka, what is happening in Southeast Asia, the movements back and forth, and so on. And even when he becomes an avatar, it's not that Buddhism declines. I mean, near Mahabalipuram, Nagapattinam, if any of you has gone there, Buddhism is thriving till the 16th century. So how do you sort of correlate and collate the two? So my response would be that let's look at the micro regions. Let's not look at this space. It was never this homogeneous space till 47. So can we differentiate and can we look at things in their micro context? So I hope that. Yes. You're coordinating.
That's fine.
I just have a question.
Okay, yeah.
Ma'am, you showed a very interesting sculptural representation where the two kings are fighting over this Buddhist relic, and ultimately it's the Brahman who's deciding. So, and this is between 1st and 2nd centuries CE. So, what I would be interested in knowing is what the agency of the Brahmins in this, distribution of the relics or the Buddhist relics. It's very interesting that it's a Brahman who's deciding. Also, it's a very stupid question that I'm going to ask is that how do we differentiate between a Buddhist monk and a Buddhist in the sculptural representation?
Okay.
Because that's a very important question. I feel that how are we doing? So the agencies of the Brahmins and whether it has become a part of the larger Hinduism. I mean, you mentioned that in 7th century it is that Vishnu avatar story is coming, but in the 1st century CE we saying that a Hindu leader, a Hindu Brahman is actually deciding. So the agency and the incorporation of Buddhism and the Hinduism is what.
Thanks. That's a great question. If Tara has been part of this book that we did, Handbook of Hindu Temples, and one of the questions we had, I mean, all of us, I come from JNU, and we don't talk about Hinduism, you talk about Brahmanical and Brahmanism. So I don't want to go into that now, but my point is that if you look at religious identity, what is it linked to? It's linked to the census. When does the census come up? Right? So the second question is how do you define religion in the Western Abrahamic understanding of religion, where religions don't talk to each other, or is it go to Ellora? There's Hindu, Buddhist, Jain shrines all together. So so which leads me when I answer your question to the point that the colonial lens.
That's exactly what I want.
Yes. And so, then what are the categories? What is the categorization? What are the categories? Religion, caste, Brahmins being one of them, but Buddhists another. I mean, the way in which Cunningham thought about Buddhism is reconstructed Victorian Buddhism, ethical. And today, if you talk about ritual in Buddhism, people say, but, Buddhism was against ritual. But so anyway, so my answer is that it's the colonial lens, which we then have to move beyond. But your second question, which is the representation, and this comes through both in the text and also in the sculptures. One of the important aspects which Buddhism or the Buddhist monks dealt with is a separate physical identity, and there's a lot of detail in the text, which talks about how monks should dress.